final wish of King Charles III was never meant to leave the walls of Clarence House, and yet tonight it has, carried on the trembling voice of the only person he trusted to speak it aloud. It did not break through the palace gates because of illness. It broke through because of a single sentence he asked his sister to remember on his behalf. For weeks, the corridors of the royal household had moved with an unusual, deliberate quietness, the kind of quietness that belongs not to peace but to preparation. Aides walked with folders pressed tight against their chests. Doors that were usually left ajar had been closed since dawn. A single row of chairs in the private drawing room had been reduced to 4, then to 3, then to 2. Something inside the machinery of the monarchy was tightening, and only a handful of people understood why. That mattered because in a house built on ritual, a change in furniture is never furniture. It is instruction. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside the private sitting room of Clarence House, the curtains had been drawn halfway, allowing a pale strip of afternoon light to fall across the carpet like a boundary line. On one side of that line stood Princess Anne, still in her navy day suit, still holding the schedule folder she had refused to release since morning. On the other side stood no one. A single armchair, upholstered in worn green, faced her in silence. It was the chair her brother had used every afternoon for the last 3 months. Today it was empty. That emptiness, in simple terms, was not absence. It was assignment. The chair had been left for her to speak to, because the king had asked her to rehearse the words before she carried them out into the world. She did not sit. She stood before the empty chair as if it were still occupied, as if the man who had ruled the family for nearly 3 years were still watching her from the cushion. She lowered her voice, not for privacy, but for weight. She spoke the sentence he had given her. She spoke it once. She spoke it twice. She waited for the room to answer. The room did not answer. It only held the sentence in the air, the way old rooms hold the last words of the people they have belonged to. Outside that door, in a narrow anteroom lined with framed regimental photographs, a private secretary stood with a leather portfolio in his hands. Inside the portfolio was a single sheet of paper. On that sheet were 9 lines of typescript, the shortest statement the household had drafted in more than a decade. He had been told not to knock. He had been told not to enter. He had been told only to wait until the Princess Royal opened the door herself, because the household had decided that whatever came next would not be delivered by a courtier. It would be delivered by family. That decision, in a palace built on hierarchy, was almost unprecedented. It meant the king had chosen intimacy over protocol. It meant he had chosen his sister over his office. It meant the wish he was about to release into the world was not administrative. It was personal. To understand why a closed door in Clarence House could carry the weight of a national tremor, one must first understand what Princess Anne has always represented within the family. She is the steady stabilizer, the sibling who never sought the throne, never sought the microphone, never sought the softening lens of public affection. She is the truth-teller in a house that speaks in coded silences. When she is asked to carry a message, that message is never ceremonial. It is structural. That mattered because the king, in choosing her, was not choosing a spokesperson, he was choosing a witness. She opened the door at 3:04. The private secretary did not speak. He simply extended the portfolio. She did not take it. Instead, she closed her hand around his wrist for a single beat, a gesture so small that anyone watching would have missed it, and then she released him and walked past. That single beat, according to a documented private account later preserved among household notes, was the moment the statement stopped being a document and became a duty. She was not accepting a page. She was accepting a promise. For the king, it was surrender to time. For the Princess Royal, it was the acceptance of a burden she had spent a lifetime pretending she did not carry. For the Prince of Wales, waiting 1 floor above, in a study whose curtains had not been opened since morning, it was the beginning of a transition he had been trained for since boyhood and yet had never wanted to arrive. For the Queen, seated alone at the far end of the long dining room, with an untouched cup of tea in front of her, it was the confirmation that the man she had married in a chapel of quiet vows was now, finally, letting go of the parts of himself he could no longer hold. Each of them heard the same sentence in a different room. Each of them heard it in a different key. The king had spoken it once, in the morning, in the low measured tone of a man who had rehearsed it in the mirror. The Princess Royal had heard it as instruction. The Prince of Wales had heard it through a household relay, as inheritance. The Queen had heard it, delivered by a lady-in-waiting who could not meet her eyes, as farewell. That mattered because in a family whose language is duty, a single sentence can mean 4 different endings at once. Prince William did not stand when the words reached him. He remained seated at his father's old writing desk, the one with the shallow scratch along the left edge where a fountain pen had slipped during a signature ceremony 40 years earlier. His hand rested flat on the wood, palm down, as if steadying not the desk but the country beneath it. He did not speak for 11 minutes. He simply looked at the small silver clock on the mantelpiece, watched the second hand travel its patient circle, and understood that from this afternoon forward, every clock in every royal room would tick a little differently. That understanding was not grief. It was arithmetic. He was already counting the days he had left as a son before he became something else entirely. The Queen did not weep. She had been told in a private conversation 2 nights earlier what the wish would be, and she had used those 2 nights to move through the private stages of it in a room no camera would ever enter. She had walked the length of the long gallery 3 times in the dark. She had opened a drawer she had not opened in 14 months and closed it again without removing anything. She had sat in the chair opposite her husband's, in the same drawing room where Princess Anne would later stand alone, and she had held his hand for the length of one radio broadcast, neither of them speaking, both of them listening to a piece of music that had not been chosen for the occasion but had chosen the occasion for them. That mattered because in the private grammar of long marriages, silence is not absence. Silence is the last language. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a dinner held 9 months earlier in the smaller of the 2 dining rooms at Highgrove, on a night when the rain had not stopped since morning and the fire had been lit before the sun had gone down. Only 4 places had been set. The king had insisted on that number. He had insisted on the room. He had insisted on the menu, a plain soup, a plain fish, a plain pudding, the sort of meal a man chooses when he wants nothing on the table to distract from the senses he intends to place upon it. He had waited until the plates were cleared. He had waited until the staff had withdrawn. He had waited until the door had been closed and the sound of footsteps in the corridor had faded into the deeper quiet of a country house at night. Then he had reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a single folded sheet of paper. He had placed it on the table without unfolding it. He had said, in a voice that carried no drama and therefore carried everything, that when the time came, he wanted only one thing to be remembered publicly, and only one person to be trusted with remembering it. He had looked across the polished surface of the table at his sister. He had not looked at his wife. He had not looked at his son. He had looked at Anne, because Anne, in the private geography of the family, had always been the compass that did not spin. She had not asked him what the sentence was. She had known that the asking would come later, in a quieter room, in a smaller hour. She had simply nodded once, and the nod had been enough. That nod, in the language of siblings who have grown up under the same roof of expectation, was a signature. It was the moment the wish became hers to keep. It was also, though neither of them knew it at the time, the moment the machinery of the monarchy began, very slowly, to turn toward this afternoon. The paper on the table that night was never unfolded. It was placed, still folded, into a small green box in the king's private study, and the box was placed on a shelf between 2 other boxes that had not been opened in a generation. That green box, in simple terms, is what the household calls a keeping box, a small container used to hold documents that are meant to be preserved without being read. It was not a will. It was not a directive. It was a promise made physical. That mattered because in a monarchy, promises that are written down have a different weight than promises that are spoken. And promises that are placed in boxes have a different weight still. They are promises that expect to be opened. The confrontation, when it came, did not take place between enemies. It took place between the king and the man who had served him longest, a senior private secretary whose name will not be spoken here, but whose presence has shaped every royal decision of the last decade. He had entered the king's study at 9:10 on the morning of the announcement. He had carried with him a folder of alternative wordings, softer phrasings, gentler constructions, the sort of language that a career of protecting the crown had taught him to prefer. He had believed until that morning that his role was to smooth the edges of what the sovereign wished to say. The king had listened. He had allowed the folder to be opened. He had allowed the alternative wordings to be read aloud. He had not interrupted. He had simply watched the fire in the small grate on the opposite wall, watched the way the flames moved without consuming, and when the last alternative had been read, he had said, very quietly, that none of them would do. He had said it once. He had not needed to say it twice. The private secretary had closed the folder. He had not argued. He had understood, in the way that men who have spent their lives reading rooms understand, that the king had already made the decision in a room that no folder could reach. That mattered because in the choreography of the crown, the moment the sovereign refuses the softer language is the moment the institution learns it is no longer in charge of the story. The silence that followed lasted 42 seconds. It was measured later by a clock that had been wound that morning by a footman who had no idea what its hands would come to witness. 42 seconds is not a long time in ordinary conversation. In a royal study, on the morning a final wish is confirmed, it is a small eternity. The private secretary had lowered his eyes. The king had lifted his. They had met briefly in the middle of the room, and in that meeting an admission had passed between them that neither would ever repeat aloud. The king had admitted, without a single word, that he was tired. The private secretary had admitted, without a single word, that he had known for months. After the confrontation, the machinery began to move. It moved, as it always does in the household, through objects rather than through announcements. A schedule that had been printed on Monday was reprinted on Tuesday with 3 engagements removed. A red box, the leather case in which government papers are delivered to the sovereign each day, was returned to Downing Street with a note attached that had not been attached before. A small silver card holder on the king's desk, the one that held the calling cards of guests expected that week, was emptied of 2 names and left empty. Empty was the new instruction. In the corridor outside the equerry's office, a wooden trolley used to carry ceremonial documents was rolled past a junior clerk who had never seen it moved during working hours. The clerk did not ask where it was going. He simply stepped aside. That stepping aside in the private choreography of the palace was itself a form of acknowledgement. The staff had begun to move around the change before the change had been named. That mattered because in institutions built on continuity, the body knows before the mind is told. The palace, in its walls and its wheels and its emptied silver holder, had already accepted what its people had not yet been permitted to say. The Princess Royal, in the hours between the confrontation and the statement, did not remain in Clarence House. She walked, alone, across the gravel path that connects the private garden to the smaller chapel at the rear of the grounds. She wore no coat, though the afternoon had turned cold. She carried nothing in her hands. She walked with the particular economy of movement that has defined her public life, the same economy that has made her, in the private opinion of her staff, the most underestimated figure in the family. She entered the chapel. She sat in the second pew from the front, not the first, because the first had always been her brother's. She sat for 11 minutes. She did not pray in any recognizable posture. She simply waited, the way a soldier waits for an order that has already been given and only needs to be received. When she rose with the sentence fully formed in her mind. She had rearranged it, in the pew, from the shape her brother had given it, into the shape her voice could carry. She had not changed a single word. She had only changed the breath between the words. That mattered because a wish, once spoken aloud, belongs partly to the mouth that speaks it, and Anne had understood in the second pew that her task was not to deliver her brother's sentence, but to deliver it in a way that would let the country believe it had come from him and not from her. Then came the second warning, the jolt that turned a private preparation into an irreversible public event. At 3 minutes, a broadcaster whose evening bulletin has framed royal news for nearly 2 decades received a call from a household contact he had not heard from in 11 months. The call lasted 19 seconds. He was not given a statement. He was not given a time. He was given only a single instruction, phrased as a courtesy but received as an ultimatum. Clear the top of the 7 o'clock hour. Do not fill it with anything else. Wait. He did not ask why. He had been in the profession long enough to know that when the household asks for the top of the hour without offering a reason, the reason will arrive on its own. He replaced the receiver. He walked out of his office. He crossed the newsroom floor without speaking to anyone, because he understood that the moment he spoke, the story would begin to leak, and he had been trusted in the 19 seconds of that call to hold it for 4 more hours. That trust, in simple terms, was a form of quiet contract, the sort of unwritten agreement that has held the relationship between the palace and the press together through every crisis of the last century. He honored it. He sat at his desk. He waited. Meanwhile, in a room at the top of Clarence House, whose windows look out over the small private garden, the king and the Princess Royal met one last time before she went out to speak. There were no aides in the room. There was no secretary. There was no camera, no recording device, no folder. There was only a small side table between them, and on that table there was a single glass of water, poured but untouched. He was not dressed in the clothes of a sovereign. He was in a soft cardigan the color of oatmeal, the sort of cardigan a man wears when he has decided that today is not a day for uniforms. She sat opposite him. She did not take his hand. She did not need to. They had grown up in a house where the deepest affections were expressed through proximity rather than touch, and proximity, in that moment, was enough. He looked at her for a long time. He did not rehearse the sentence again. He had already trusted it to her. Instead, he told her, in a voice so quiet that it would have been inaudible to anyone standing 3 feet away, that he was not afraid. He said it once. He waited. He said it again. She nodded. That was the whole of their goodbye. That mattered, because in the language of a family that has said goodbye in front of the world more times than any other family alive, the goodbye that is not seen is always the goodbye that carries the most weight. She stood. She smoothed the front of her jacket with a single movement of her right hand, a movement so practiced that it belonged less to her than to the century of women who had preceded her in that room. She walked to the door. She paused, one hand on the handle, and she did not look back. Not looking back, in the private grammar of the family, was itself an act of respect. To look back would have been to invite him to say more, and he had already said everything he intended to say. She opened the door. She stepped through. She closed it behind her without sound. The palace, from that moment forward, ceased to belong to the private world. It belonged once again to the country. Outside the gates of Clarence House, the first small crowd had begun to gather. They had not been summoned. They had not been informed. They had simply felt, in the way that crowds have always felt these things, that something was about to be said, and they had come to be present when it was. A woman in a green raincoat held a small bunch of flowers she had not yet decided whether to leave. A man in a dark overcoat stood with his hands in his pockets, looking not at the gates but at the sky, as if the sky might issue the statement before the palace did. A child, no older than 7, held her mother's hand and asked, in a whisper, whether the king was still inside. The mother did not answer. She did not know. No one did. At 6 minutes to 7, the door of Clarence House opened, and Princess Anne stepped out into the pale evening light. She was not accompanied. She carried no folder. She carried no notes. She walked to the small lectern that had been placed on the gravel drive, and she stood behind it without adjusting it, because she had been told, in the second pew of the chapel, that the wish would carry further if she did not fidget with the stand that held it. She waited until the cameras had settled. She waited until the crowd behind the railings had fallen silent. She waited until the only sound in the courtyard was the low rustle of the flag on the pole above her. Then she spoke. She did not begin with a title. She did not begin with a preamble. She began with the sentence her brother had given her, and she gave it back to the world in the shape he had asked for. She said that the king's final wish, in the days that remained to him, was that the country would remember him not as a monarch but as a man who had tried, with whatever time he had been given, to leave the family and the institution he loved a little steadier than he had found them. She said it once. She did not repeat it. She did not embellish it. She simply allowed the sentence to stand in the air between her and the crowd, the way her brother had allowed the folded paper to stand on the table at Highgrove, unopened and complete. The silence that followed was the loudest silence the courtyard had heard in a generation. It was not empty. It was full. It was full of the weight of what had not been said, the weight of what would not need to be said, the weight of a wish that had chosen simplicity over spectacle. The woman in the green raincoat lowered her flowers to her chest. The man in the dark overcoat closed his eyes. The child stopped asking questions. The flag on the pole did not move. Across the country, in living rooms and pubs and hospital wards and shop back rooms, the evening bulletin cut to the courtyard, and the broadcaster, who had been given 19 seconds of warning 4 hours earlier, did not fill the silence with commentary. He allowed the sentence to travel on its own. He allowed the pause to breathe. He allowed the country to receive the wish in the shape it had been given. That, according to a recorded internal note later circulated among his colleagues, was the hardest broadcasting decision of his career, and also the easiest. He had understood, in the moment the Princess Royal spoke, that any word he added would only diminish what she had said. He said nothing. He was praised for it later. He deserved to be. In a small terraced house in the north of England, a retired postman who had delivered letters through the reigns of 2 sovereigns and the coronation of a 3rd sat forward in his armchair and pressed one hand flat against the surface of the television, as if steadying it. He did not weep. He simply said to no one in particular that it was a good wish. He said it once. He said it again. His wife in the kitchen did not answer. She had already begun to cry quietly over the kettle, and she did not want him to hear. In a newspaper office in central London, a night editor held the front page of the following morning's edition in his hands and stared at the single line of headline type that had been set an hour earlier and would not need to be changed. The line read simply, in the largest font the paper had used in 11 years, that the king had asked to be remembered as a man. Beneath the line was a single photograph, taken at a distance, of the Princess Royal walking back through the door of Clarence House, with her head neither high nor low, but exactly level. The editor did not add a subheading. He did not need to. He handed the page to the print floor. He went home. For the king, it was release. For the Princess Royal, it was the completion of a promise made across a plain dinner table 9 months earlier. For the Prince of Wales, seated still in the study with his hand still flat on the scratched wood of the desk, it was the moment he understood that the monarchy he would one day inherit had already begun, quietly, to become his. For the Queen, walking now along the long gallery she had walked 3 times in the dark, it was the beginning of a private life she had not been allowed to imagine in more than 3 decades of marriage. Each of them received the same wish. Each of them received it in a different room. Each of them received it in the same silence. The king gave the country honesty. The Princess Royal gave the country grace. The Prince of Wales gave the country patience. The Queen gave the country the dignity of a farewell that did not ask to be watched. Between them, in the space of a single afternoon, they had shown what the institution had always claimed to be, and had not always been, which is a family first and a crown second, a group of people first and a set of titles second, a private grief first and a public performance never. The gates of Clarence House closed at 17 minutes past 7. The crowd did not disperse. The candles that had not been planned began to appear along the railings, small points of light in the deepening evening, placed by hands that did not speak to one another because they did not need to. The flowers that had been carried in uncertainty were laid down in certainty. The child who had asked whether the king was still inside was lifted onto her father's shoulders so that she could see the flag, still and low against the darkening sky. Inside, in the drawing room where the empty green chair still faced the drawn curtain, the king sat down at last. He did not turn on a lamp. He did not open a book. He simply sat in the same chair his sister had spoken to earlier in the afternoon, and he listened to the sound of the courtyard outside as it changed from silence into the soft, cumulative murmur of a country beginning to say goodbye. He closed his eyes. He allowed himself, for the first time in many months, to be tired without apology. The wish had been delivered. The sentence had been carried. The promise made across a plain dinner table had been kept. There was nothing more to say. And in a small green box on a shelf between two older boxes in a study whose door had been closed for the evening, a single folded sheet of paper waited, still unopened, holding within it the private handwriting of a man who had trusted his sister to speak his final wish aloud before the paper itself would ever need to be read. That box would remain closed for many years. That mattered because some promises, once spoken, no longer require the paper on which they were written. They live, instead, in the mouths of the people who loved the person who wrote them, and in the memory of the country that listened, on a pale evening in a quiet courtyard, while a sister stood at a lectern and gave a brother back to history in the shape he had asked for. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.